Ukraine's President Zelensky has accused Russia of committing war crimes in territory recently retaken by Ukrainian forces in the northeast of the country. Officials say that they found more than 400 graves containing civilians and around 20 soldiers who are said to have had their hands bound. They were discovered in the city of Izyum, which Russian forces captured in April. Ukraine says the bodies will be exhumed and sent for forensic examination. Izyum is among the areas back in Ukrainian hands after significant territorial gains in recent days, although heavy fighting is continuing in the areas shown in circles here. Our correspondent Orla Guerin has sent this report from Izyum, and it contains some distressing images.
Under the pine trees of Izyum, a war crimes investigation. This burial site has more than 400 graves, now being exhumed, the earth starting to give up its secrets. But the prosecutor here already claiming that one way or another, Russia killed virtually all of the dead. According to our data, almost everyone died because of Russian soldiers, says Alexander Filchakov. Some were killed, some were tortured, some were hit in Russian air and artillery strikes. He says the very first grave they opened contained the body of a civilian with a rope around his neck. Almost all the dead here are said to be civilians, women and children among them. But a senior official told us there was one mass grave with more than 20 soldiers. Some had their hands bound and bore signs of torture. For those at the scene, it was hard to take. This is a distressing sight, but Ukraine is determined that the world should see it. Graves are being opened here one by one. It's only now, after the Russians have been pushed out, that the authorities can really investigate and can establish how many victims they left behind. They were buried here in makeshift graves, many marked only with a number. Among them, a 65-year-old called Ludmila, who was killed in March in heavy Russian shelling. Her husband Grigory tells me then he had to bury her in the yard. She was brought here in August. Now her remains will be disturbed again. She was beloved, he says. We had no children. God didn't give us that gift, but we were in love. As the graves were exhumed, security forces were still eliminating threats with controlled detonations of Russian mines. Maxim came to the burial site to tell his story and show the marks on his wrists and ankles where he was shackled. He says he was held by the Russians for a week earlier this month and tortured with electric shocks. They connected wires, he tells me. You start shaking and trying to set yourself free. I fell from my chair. It was very painful. I asked my cellmates how long I was gone. They said 40 minutes. I think after 15 or 20 minutes, you pass out. As the day wore on, workers from the emergency services were drained by their labours. But they expect to be digging at more sites like this in other areas recently taken back from the Russians. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Izyum.
Well, joining me now is our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. Jeremy, some disturbing material there, but do we really know what has happened?
Well, we know what they've been telling reporters there, like Orla. that they've found some bodies that look as if they had been badly treated. You know, more awful tragedy in Ukraine, but is it war crimes? Well, you don't really know that until there's been a proper investigation. In previous wars, there were big forensic operations opening these graves to try and really treat them like a crime scene, to try and find out what happened, and full examinations of the corpses. And certainly over the years, the one thing I'd say about that is that you saw those lines of crosses. Now, over the years as a journalist, I've seen quite a few massacres in places, and it's quite rare that they would bury people who were killed illegally, unlawfully, in individual graves like that and keep a record. Generally speaking, what they probably do is dig a pit and push them in.
Well, this discovery was made in territory that was taken back from the Russians in recent days. We can see it there on the screen over in the east. Just remind us how important Izyum is and why it's significant.
Yeah, that little area, sort of purpley colour up there on the map, it's important because it's strategically towards the place where the Russians in red still control it, and they would bring supplies through there, which clearly they can't do now. So it's working on a couple of different levels, the importance of this. First of all, on the battlefield, an extraordinary breakthrough for the Ukrainians, may even turn the tide of the war. It's too soon to say that. Also a reminder that the Russian army has really serious problems in terms of morale, in terms of command and control, in terms of intelligence, in terms of firepower. Even there, those guys apparently were not well armed. So it works on a wider level too, though, because this is something that President Putin has to try and explain. And he's been at this summit, a regional summit in Uzbekistan, and he's actually stood up and said, well, yes, I appreciate that you, the Chinese, have some misgivings about that. They're meant to be his best ally. Big contrast there with Ukraine. Their best ally, the United States, is sending them about $1 billion worth of equipment per week, and they're making it tell. Meanwhile, the Chinese president is not even mentioning Ukraine in his speech. So I think maybe it could be that these countries, like individuals, they want to back the winner. And maybe to start with, they thought that they were in terms of President Putin and Ukraine. But now he's increasingly under a lot of pressure, criticism at home as well of the war effort. And so they're thinking, wait a minute, do we want to be associated with this?
OK. Jeremy, thank you very much. Jeremy Bowen.